Hello, in this video, we would like to talk about interpretations of Indian history, colonial, nationalist, and post colonial. A reading done by Romila Thapar. She begins her article with colonial interpretation. She says that colonial historians had this presumed need to rediscover Indian history. She further argues that early 19th century onwards reconstruction of Indian history was tied to European perception. She further says the intellectual history of Europe was pertinent to the interpretation of the history of India. India was the other, and the other is always important to understand the self. She then goes on and talks about legitimacy and control. She says, in order to reconstruct and restructure Indian history, the colonial historian, they drew comparisons with the European history or between the European history on one hand and the Indian history on the other hand. How the other had a history which was different from European history. Another important thing Romila Thapar talks about is colonial belief in knowledge as a source of power. She says that these colonial administrators they believed in knowledge and they considered knowledge as a source of power. This belief was rampant throughout the 19th century. She further argues that knowing the history provided control over it. So the British Raj or the British officials believed that knowing the history provided control over it. This is the reason that Lord Curzon, someone whom we know who partitioned Bengal into two parts in 1905, he says that knowledge of history is the necessary furniture of British Empire. Knowledge of history is the necessary furniture of British Empire. Recasting the knowledge of the colony was a kind of curiosity about the past of the colony, right? Romila Thapar argues that colonial historiography had a big agenda, though it was not a hidden agenda. So their belief in knowledge, they treated history or knowledge of history as source of power. They wanted to get legitimacy out of it. They wanted to reconstruct Indian history. They wanted to draw comparisons between Indian history on one hand and the European history on the other hand. They all did it in order to gain legitimacy, in order to control India, and in order to justify their rule on India. Remember, in the previous reading when we did Shekhar Bandyopadhyay approaches to the study of nationalism, we talked about we talked about that British administration British administration believed that they had this self-professed mission to civilize Indians and to take them out from decadence to the desired state of progress. This is the what they believed in. So they had this educative or civilizing mission in India. This is the reason we did it in the previous reading that utilitarians they wanted to civilize and educate Indians, and this is their goal actually. Let's move to the next point, which Romila Thapar talks about Orientalist scholarship. So, Orientalist scholarship was embodied in people like William Jones, who created Asiatic Society in Calcutta, and it was created in 1784 to encourage Oriental studies. Orientalists explored the new terrain of the Indian past and tried to link it to the European past. For example, linguistic links were sought between Sanskrit on one hand and Greek and Latin on the other hand. An attempt to draw conceptual and chronological links with biblical history was also done. Okay. Orientalist scholars they focused upon shastras in order to understand the source of India's social laws. The study was not only just an intellectual curiosity but also had an administrative function. The notion of controlling the society by understanding its earlier institutions became an important item on the intellectual agenda of the Orientalist scholars. Then Romila Thapar talks about Aryan race theory. She says that Aryan race theory emerged out of Orientalist scholarship. This theory was developed in 19th century. The theory maintains that Indian history begins with the invasion of the Aryans. Aryan, the superior people who came from Central Asia, subjugated the whole of North India and founded an Aryan civilization. Aryan race theory evolved on the basis of race science in Europe. Then Romila Thapar talks about social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is the theory of the survival of the fittest. Those who are the fittest deserve to survive. This is the belief behind this theory. The fittest were the European Aryans because they dominated world civilization. Max Müller, the famous German Sanskritist at Oxford, was the first historian to superimpose this theory of Aryan race on India. The theory said that race and language were identical. The theory said that race and language were similar or identical. Further, according to this theory, caste was seen essentially as racial segregation, each caste being visualized as a separate race. Each caste was visualized as a separate race. It was argued that Indian society was extremely advanced for it had managed to segregate all these racial groups in a social system known as caste. The idea of the purity of caste, purity and pollution is the basis of Varna system. The upper castes were of Aryan race, lower castes were indigenous and mixed. Okay. Although this theory was discounted by Jyotirao Phule and some other social reformers. Max Müller, he says Aryans were of a superior race and brought civilization to India. This was appreciated by the colonialist historians. The theory of Aryan race became endemic to the reconstruction of Indian history, and the reasons for this are varied. The preeminence given to the role of the Brahmins in the Orientalist construction of Indology was endorsed by the centrality of the Vedas. The Aryan theory, this is something very important, the Aryan theory also provided the colonized with status and self esteem, arguing that they were linguistically and racially of the same stock as the colonizers. The upper castes are the lineal descendants of the Aryans. Okay. This varied exploitation of the theory, Aryan race theory, received a jolt, argues Romila Thapar, not in this reading, somewhere else, with the archaeological discovery of the Indus civilization. The excavation of the sites of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro in the 1920s and subsequent excavations in India and Pakistan, revealing an extensive urban culture in the northern and western parts of the Indian subcontinent, created problems for the Aryan theory. Being predominantly urban, the Indus culture is distinctively different from the pastoral agrarian society described in the Vedic texts. Now let's move to utilitarian historians. Earlier we talked about Orientalists, those who had a liking for Indian culture, Indian literary traditions, and Indian values and Indian education system. Utilitarian historians were actually inspired by Jeremy Bentham, a very famous historian as well as philosopher. Utilitarian historians actually emphasized upon the weaknesses of the Indian civilization. They argued that there was tremendous need of rationality as well as individualism if the Indian society was to progress. If the Indian society has to progress, it has to, it has to, it has to actually move in the direction of rationality. It has to adopt rationality in order to progress in life. Change needs to be legislated, a departure from Orientalists who wanted to believe in status quo. Muller. Indians mediating peacefully for endless years in their little village communities, the utilitarians argued that this needs to be changed to rid India out of backwardness. So, utilitarian historians, they all are talking about that Indian culture needs a drastic overhaul, a drastic transformation. We need to adopt the Western culture in order to actually improve the Indian culture or Indian traditions. Let's talk about periodization. This Romila Thapar emphasizes upon, underscores this point very much in her reading. She says utilitarian school of historiography, regarding this school, Indian society lacked rationality and individualism, and hence the European civilization was needed to make the stagnant Indian society progressive. This was a departure from the Oriental school's non interventionist policies. This was a departure from the Oriental school's non interventionist policies. This school of historiography is responsible for the three staged periodization of the Indian history into the Hindu civilization, the Muslim civilization, and the British period. Hindu civilization, Muslim civilization, and the British period. And Romila Thapar discounts this periodization. She simply does not agree with this periodization. She says that you cannot reduce these three periods into just Hindu, Muslim, and British period. They had more than this. These three periods had more than this. Now let's talk about James Mill, who wrote a massive 3-volume history of British India. He wrote a massive 3-volume history of British India. This history is a hegemonic text and is still relevant. This periodized Indian history into Hindu, Muslim, and the British eras. Okay, let's now talk about tripartite division of Indian history, and this is something not from the reading but from some article from the Hindu. So it was James Mill who metamorphosed or developed or changed into the entire long history of ancient and medieval India, divesting it of all its diversities by making the religious identity of the rulers instead of their nature the central category for understanding the past. All diversity of explanation was lost to the uniformity of the religious identity of all the rulers, whether Hindu or Muslim. His History of British Rule, published in 1818, created the tripartite division of India's past into the Hindu, the Muslim, and the British period. Let's move on. Colonialism tantamount to modernity. Since then, the tripartite division has remained operative in the teaching of history in India, and even when the nomenclature was altered to ancient, medieval, and modern, first by Stanley Lane Poole in 1903. The basis of division remained the same until around the early 1960s. Let's move to Oriental despotism. So Romila Thapar argues about Oriental despotism. This utilitarian school, created the concept of Oriental despotism, which again was used to legitimize the colonial conquest of the Indian subcontinent. It should be noted, this theory argues that it should be noted that this change in historical thinking also coincided with a change in the colonial policies. By this time, the colonial conquest of India was nearly complete, and the need of the hour was to reconstruct the economic structure of the colony so as to be a source of raw material. India being a source of raw material and an importer of the finished British goods. So, how the British used India in order to extract as much as raw resources, raw minerals, raw resources from here, send the minerals or resources to Britain, and get finished goods here in India back to India, and they used to sell them these products and used to make the profit. This is how. So India was a source of raw material as well as an importer of the finished British goods. Thus the change from a non-interventionist to an interventionist policy. Okay. Now let's talk about Mill. Mill argued that the pre-British Hindu and Muslim civilizations were not only backward and stagnant, but conformed to the image of Oriental despotism. This is James Mill, very famous argument, that the pre-British Hindu and Muslim civilizations were not only backward and stagnant, but conformed to the image of Oriental despotism. By the middle of 19th century, the British conquest of India had been completed. The emergence of British industrialization gave rise to the need to reconstruct the economic structure of the colony so that it would supply resources and provide markets for industries in Britain. Later half of the 19th century. This time, aggressive capitalism was changing into imperialism with its much more intensive exploitation of the colonies. This led to putting forth new ideologies to justify and legitimize change in the colonies. Karl Marx, he says, Asian societies are different. No private property in land, no class contradictions, and no class conflict. India was, in a sense, a stagnant society. Therefore, even though British colonialism did much harm, it was a necessary intervention, for it broke the stagnancy of the Indian past. This is something very important, and this is the reason that I am repeating this statement. He says, even though British colonialism did much harm to India, it was a necessary intervention because it broke the stagnancy of the Indian past. Let's now talk about Max Weber. Max Weber, he says, capitalism did not emerge in Asia due to absence of the Puritan ethic in the religions of both India and China. He adds, there was no possibility of accommodating the rationality of economies in Indian religions. Romila Thapar then says, there is a noticeable disregard in the writings of Karl Marx and Max Weber for empirical data which might suggest the contrary. She is now discounting them, rejecting them. This disregard is perceptible in European considerations of the Indian past. Focus remains on theory. And what is the theory? Stagnancy. And empirical data is often ignored or marginalized. The uniqueness of India lied in its caste system, and Brahmanism was responsible for creation of the caste system. This is how Romila Thapar argues it. The nationalist interpretation. Let's now talk about nationalist interpretation. This school of historians emerged towards the end of the 19th century. This was used for the anti-colonial movement for independence. In this school, history was used for two purposes. Firstly, to establish the identity of Indians, and secondly, by establishing the superiority of the past over the present. The remote past, referred to by Mill as Hindu civilization, became the Golden Age. This was very convenient because the more remote the Golden Age, the more imaginative were its reconstructions, as they could not always be tested factually. Mill's periodization of Indian history was accepted by this school. A dichotomy was projected of a spiritual India as against a materialist West. This dichotomy is evident in all its historiography. Let's now talk about a civilization of multiple identities. Writing of history based on religious nationalism, like Hindu Muslim, gave rise to communal interpretations of India's past. This was shaped by the politics of 1920s and 1930s. This kind of communal binary is opposed to the history that examines social and economic history. Rise of the BJP and Hindu nationalism that constantly reiterate communal interpretations of Indian history. These are in fact a distortions of Indian history and are ideologically limited. I'll repeat the last line. Romila Thapar, she argues these are in fact a distortions of Indian history and are ideologically limited. Right? India has always been a civilization of multiple identities. So Romila Thapar here talks about monolithic identity. She discredits monolithic identity. She says that India has always been a multi dimensional. India has always maintained multi-dimensional identity or identities. Now let's talk about the post-colonial interpretation. There are two directions in which Indian history has moved. One is Marxist historical writing and the other one is subaltern studies. The former was a major influence in the 1960s and 70s. An interesting fact about this school is the following. Though it used Marxist analysis, the dialectical method and historical materialism, it moved away from the given patterns that Marx and Engels had worked out for Asian history. Another issue of debate is whether Marx's five-stage theory of European history, like primitive communism and slave society, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, does it apply to India? This is the question actually. Okay, let's talk about the contribution of Marxist historiography. This is not directly from the reading but outside. So, the history of the dynasties was replaced by the history of the common people. More emphasis was now given to the study of economy and society. This is the contribution of Marxist historiography. More emphasis was now given to the study of economy and society in preference to the political history. Romila Thapar argues that the focus in the 1970s shifted to social and economic history and questioning of existing periodization. Let's now talk about drain theory. The focus of these debates has frequently been on periods of change. In the 1970s, the question was whether there had been incipient capitalism in India prior to the colonial expansion in the 19th century, and what was the state of Indian economy. The famous drain theory is a case in point. With industrialization in Britain, Indian wealth was drained to Britain, fundamentally impoverishing Indian society. Let's now talk about subaltern studies and thinkers. These thinkers began to look at the vast underclass that constitutes the flip side of the rulers and elites of the British Empire in India between 1757 and 1947. They consider oral tradition as a legitimate historical source material. This kind of history then challenges the validity of making broad-based generalizations. Romila Thapar argues she is in favor of generalization, for to focus on the fragment when pulled apart and analyzed, there is a tendency to ignore the whole to which the fragment belongs. It has had a tremendous impact on many aspects of third world history outside India. It has international visibility and this has encouraged comparative studies which historians are now taking much more seriously. Okay, let's now conclude this video. Thank you very much for watching.